So let's go a little bit deeper into this idea of socialization. It's a term I'm sure you know, right? It's how individuals internalize the roles, the norms, the habits and expectations and language and a variety of things. But these roles and norms that a society that you belong to wants you to have. Right? You become a member of that society because you're socialized into it. If you were socialized into a totally different society, you would not be a great match for this one. You'd always feel a little out of place, or at least it would take a lot of cultural capital and re-socializing to feel like you fit in, right? But it's worth noting that socialization is only an attempt. It is not always successful. It can be tweaked and altered. And there are various outcomes based on how successful the program of socialization is in a given society. How heavy-handed is it? How loose is it? So we'll talk about a few things. We'll talk about unsuccessful or failed socialization. We'll talk about competing socializations. And we'll talk about re-socialization, because these are all very different components of how socialization can vary across groups of people or whole societies even. So first, let's start with failed or unsuccessful socialization. That's where, for whatever reason, an individual or a whole group of people were not successfully socialized into the norms and roles of a given society. In this case, the people who were not successfully socialized, they're often labeled as deviant in some way. Or crazy, right? Deviance can be that, oh, you're out of your mind, or you're a criminal, you're dangerous, you're unstable, something's wrong with you. There's a lot of different types of labels. You're sick, right? But because the person is not behaving in the expected ways, right? Maybe we'll say, okay, there's some kind of mental disorder going on. Or maybe it's a tight religious group and somebody just does not play the game. They do not socialize into that, and they think, well, you're a heathen, you're backslidden, or they're not going to follow the rules of private property and capitalism, and we say you're a thief, you're a criminal, right? So it's, on one hand, somebody might not be fully socialized into the expectations, but there are some extreme cases where somebody was not given enough social cues at key windows, key moments of their life to even have the kind of brain structures to know how to be socialized into a setting. So this is not a case where they were socialized into a different set of goals or a different society, and now they're out, sort of a fish out of water, habitus mismatch, like we talked about before. This is a case where they weren't given enough socialization to begin with. And the most extreme cases are in sometimes what are coined feral children, right? So occasionally there will be a kid who, through some kind of extreme neglect or abandonment or something, maybe they got lost in the forest as a kid and somehow survived all on their own for years. Or in some really sad cases, parents kind of locking their kids in rooms and giving them just enough food to survive, but not really talking to them, not letting them go to school or have friends. And these kids end up with some very significant problems. And it's very difficult, perhaps even impossible, for them to catch up later in life because our brains are very much, they need the social interaction. And so many of the just ways of being in society that are essential for a thriving life, we take for granted, right? That you don't just walk around down the street naked. You put some clothes on, right? Like you would be mortified. You would be like, it'd be a horrible experience if somebody gave you $1 million and said you got to walk from here, a mile through the center of town nude, right? People have nightmares about this kind of thing because we're socialized to want the norms of our society, and not just to have clothing, but to wear certain kinds of clothing, right? So it is possible to be unsuccessfully socialized, or in extreme cases of like feral children, to lack just minimum levels of socialization. That's not a good thing, right? That's not people being their most authentic, true selves because they're not following the program of society. That is somebody being totally out of step with knowing how to survive, quite frankly. Now, different than failed socialization is competing socializations. Now, this can happen in complex societies where there's tension you face between different cultural identities that are available to you. Maybe you live in a bicultural home. Your parents practice different religions or from different ethnic groups. and you are kind of torn, right? What language are you going to speak of these options? Which religion are you going to follow? Which side of the family are you going to get closer to? And both of them want you. Both of them are offering these signals of socialization. Here's the roles you should play. Here are the norms, habits, tastes, preferences you should have. But they're in conflict with each other. There's a tension between them, and you're not sure which one you really want to participate in. And that can create what we call identity crisis. Identity crisis does not happen because you were not socialized, right? That's a whole different thing. Identity crisis happens when there's competing socializations that lead to different ideals of who you could be. You can envision yourself being this ideal kind of person and also this ideal kind of person. But it's difficult to do both well because you feel like you're either letting yourself down or you're letting your tribe or group or some close circle of loved ones, people you care about or respect, you're letting them down. Religion's a great example. One side of the family is agnostic and you want to follow your passions and live however you want to live, but this other side wants you to have an arranged marriage and be a good fill in the blank whatever religion, and so you're kind of torn. Which that no matter what you do, there will be some feeling of betrayal, either to yourself or to a close group of loved ones. And that's a difficult place to be in. Now, do note that successful socialization, if I say, okay, that person is successfully socialized into that society, they're a functioning member of that society, they're perceived as, people can recognize them as, oh yeah, they're one of us, right? That does not necessarily mean that the person is happy with their role, right? You could be a peasant or a slave or, go through any society through history, and there's always a status hierarchy. And somebody at the lowest rungs of that status hierarchy might not be happy with the role that they have or the position they occupy. But that may not mean that they have an identity crisis because of competing socialization. They might have fully internalized, yeah, this is who I am. I'm not thrilled about it, but it's the only choice to me. And they may not even really reflect on alternative lifestyles or different ways of living and being. They might just kind of grumble but get on with being a peasant, or grumble and get on with being a slave, because socialization is very powerful, right? And so they may not have an identity crisis. They might just try to make the most of the position they have and assume that there really is no choice. Now, to some degree, everybody has agency to challenge the institutions in their society. But we also know that institutions can be very powerful and very coercive. And when you challenge an institution, when you don't play the role, as we already mentioned, you'll get labeled, you'll get stigmatized, right, as deviant in some way, or crazy, or dangerous, and it can be very bad to challenge that, depending on the instance we're talking about. And this can lead to a term we use in sociology called alienation. So if a society is so heavy-handed in their socialization that they tell you, hey, you have to do this. In fact, you must desire to. If you don't want to play this role, there's something wrong with you, right? And whatever that role is, so a certain kind of religious person, or to get married, to be a housewife, to whatever to work in the factory, right? There are societies that have taught people, or to become a good soldier and put your life on the line. Societies sometimes, not always, not in all cases, but some can be so heavy-handed on their program of socialization that a person really feels that they really internalize the desire to do that thing, even if that thing may not be great for them. And we call that alienation, when you feel like, no, there's really no other choice I have. Of course, I want to do my duty, or to serve my country, or to be a good housewife and mom, or whatever that program is, that may or may not be ideal for that person. Societies often have a way of trying to push a heavy-handed set of expectations on people. Now, again, that's not all societies. Societies will range between loose and tight cultural expectations. Let's move to this third one, re-socialization. Now, this happens when you're moving from one primary group and then you're moving to another primary group, right? So an example might be, say you're arrested and you're sentenced to life in prison. Well, now you have to be totally re-socialized from being a free person out in public to being a prisoner, where you'll conceivably spend the rest of your life. Or maybe you're drafted into the military. Right? There's a war, you're drafted, they tell you have no choice. And suddenly you used to be very kind of whimsical and artsy and free-flowing, but now you have to be a good soldier. You got to go through boot camp, and you got to totally kind of change the set of expectations you have. Or maybe you join some really tight-knit religious, cult, we'll say, and their expectations on how you live are totally different than your previous life. Now, those are extreme cases. Those are cases of what we call total institutions, where everything in your social world is encapsulated in that institution, where you work, where you sleep, whatever kind of relationships you're able to have, so on and so forth. Not every institution is that totalizing, right? So that's why we call them total institutions. But anytime somebody is moving from one primary group as their core social reference, social context, to another one that's pretty different, being the core social context, and it doesn't always have to be a total institution, right? Maybe you're married for many, many years, divorced, and you have to learn to live a new kind of life, or you practice a certain career for many, many years, and due to an injury or you lose your license for some reason, now you have to retrain for a totally different career path. It can be things like that too, or you're one religion, then you switch religions, or you decide you no longer believe in that religion. This requires a process of re-socialization. So often there are rituals about stripping away previous identities, especially in the total institutions. Think of the parallels between going into the military and going into prison. It might shave your head, put you in a kind of uniform, right? They strip away aspects of your identity that were part of your previous self, because that helps you adapt to re-socialize into this new social order, right? And you might experience certain things like culture shock, right? And suddenly every situation is novel. We've talked about how our brains prefer routine. And so you have to go through that process. There might be mourning, a feeling of loss of the old self. But often, and this is you see this when people are beginning to do the work of adapting to the new social environment, is that they'll rewrite one's own personal narrative. They'll think of their past, they'll pull out memories of it, and they might kind of change their experience of that memory, right? So they thought they were going to be married to this person forever. This person leaves them. And suddenly, in the years or a couple of years later, you start hearing them saying stories that you'd never heard them say before about how horrible that person was, how unhappy they were, how they don't think they really ever even loved them to begin with, right? Well, that might not have been true for the experience they were having back then, but it helps them connect their new life, this new identity, their experience of the past, that helps them connect that to their new life, to their new reality, right? Or you leave one religion for another, or for no religion at all, and somebody might start having even worse memories of how that past religion was, the people, how it treated them, or how dumb in their minds the ideas of it were. And they might even use phrases, I was blind, but now I see, or I was never really happy until this change, right? And so it's probably somewhat overstated, but it provides an important function of helping somebody transition from one social reality to a new social reality. And this is an ongoing process. Socialization doesn't end, right? We talked about there's primary and then secondary. Primary ends when you shift into secondary, but secondary socialization is an always continuous process. Now, lots of your socialization is fixed, pretty similar to the idea of habitus, but there's always an allowance for some change. Now, in some radical circumstances, you move from one social environment to another. There might be more rapid or radical change, and you might see whole personality change, and dispositions and preferences start to shift faster. Most of us don't go through that. Our social environments are relatively stable from one context to the next. But that doesn't mean every year there aren't some things that are evolving based on different relationships that come in and out of our lives, expectations at work or life stages. The new trends in culture that we're absorbing, both consciously, like trying to change with intention, and subconsciously, just learning by association, And then we realize 10 years later, oh gosh, I'm actually pretty different than I used to be. And you didn't even realize it happened. The music you like, or the foods you like, or where you want to travel to, or maybe you don't want to travel at all anymore. These kinds of things. And then lastly, Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, in their book, The Social Construction of Reality, they talk about this idea of a good death. And it's very much linked to socialization. So when you think about your own, future mortality, your own death, what would be a good death? If you really thought about it, like what would be a good way to die? And what they're not getting at is, something quick and painless. That's not the argument that they're getting at when they talk about the power of a good death, but rather that your socialization was so successful that you held to it with the kind of confidence to and beyond your last breath, right? So that your worldview had integrity. And by integrity, I don't mean a subjective sense of values. I mean that it stayed intact, right? The ship didn't break apart. That, as you approach death, now let's assume it's not all of a sudden, but you see it coming. Maybe you have a terminal illness. Now these are rough waters, right? That's a scary time. If, as you're approaching death, your worldview begins to kind of shake apart in those rough waters, so to speak, that is not a good death. That increases the anxiety of your own mortality, right? If suddenly somebody is occupied by wait, what do you think happens after I die? They're questioning their religion. They're questioning their whole life and choices. And there's a lot of that anxiety is coming from not being fully socialized, right? The death does not have to be swift and painless, though. I mean, you could imagine a warrior society, for example, where the most glorious thing is to die in battle. And so somebody looks forward to going out on the battlefield and, get killed with a sword or something, because that's how they want to die, because they know there's honor in it. Or maybe somebody's in a religious group that does not believe in medical intervention, and they have a very painful terminal illness, and they could take morphine or some other painkiller, or euthanasia, for example, physician-assisted suicide or something. But their religious worldview says, no, you can't have any of that. And so while they're in agony up towards their death, they might still actually feel the psychological comfort of knowing that their worldview is intact, right? God is testing me, and I am passing this test, and I'll be rewarded in the next life for not taking this medical intervention that I'm not supposed to have. So there's a lot of circumstances in which the death you have may not be painless or swift, but a good death is when your social worldview has enough integrity that it stays intact through very difficult times, the chief of which would be your own impending mortality.